Thanks for staying with us here on Morning Live. Now, since the COVID-19 pandemic and lockdowns began, the majority of parents with children who attend fee-paying schools are struggling to keep up with their payments. And our next guest, Michelle Dickens, who's the managing director at TPN Credit Bureau, says that during the lockdown, less than 1 in 2 parents was actually able to pay their school fees in full. And August was the worst month for school fee collection, with only 45.9% of parents paid up. And this increased in November when 52% of parents were able to pay. Michelle Dickens joins us now to tell us a little bit more about this. Michelle, thanks for your time. Welcome to Morning Live.
Wonderful. Thanks for having me.
So before we get into the actual payment issues, Michelle, perhaps we could just take a minute to explain how a fee-paying school differs from other state-run schools.
So in South Africa, children have access to education, and that access to education is split between both private and public schools, where private schools make up 6.5%. The majority of children obviously attending are public schools, and in fact 66% attend no fee-paying schools. So what we're left with then is our fee-paying public schools. And here the parents supplement the income subsidies of the government in order to add additional SGB teachers, for example, onto the budget, or to increase capacity in terms of IT infrastructure or in terms of classroom infrastructure. So the parents pay additional fees in order to create additional value for the learners.
So how much of these fee-paying schools' actual running costs come from the Department of Basic Education's budget? I mean, how much of their budget is paid for by parents as well?
So when we look at the payments by parents, what TPN does is we collect the data from the schools to understand how the parents are paying their school fees on a monthly basis. And it differs from school to school. Each school will have a different allocation in terms of the additional costs that the parents would pay. And what TPN does is we look to understand how those school fees are paid, and we understand that in the past that's a cyclical payment. So often school fees are one of the last payments to be paid by consumers, parents, and often it's at the beginning of the year or at the end of the year when these payments are first made and then caught up towards the end of the year as well. And during the lockdown period, we find that to be even more extreme. So, for example, coming into 2020, December 2019, 67% of parents were paid up by the end of the year. Right now, in December 2020, we're looking at a number of only 52%. So even before lockdown, you would find that school fees were a difficult payment to collect on. During the lockdown period, it wasn't simply a case of non-payment. There was a lot of partial payments that were made as well, but 45% of parents were paid up by the August month. So this is the worst that we've seen on record. And of course, parents have the opportunity to apply for exemptions. So where we're looking to collect school fees from public schools, we're looking to collect fees from parents who have an income and therefore are able to afford their school fees. Whereas parents who have had a loss of income, either temporary or partial or in full, they can then apply to the school for those exemptions. And those amounts would then be credited to their account, and they would no longer be required to pay them.
In terms of that, Michelle, were you able to track how many parents actually applied for exemptions at these fee-paying schools? How many actually succeeded in having those exemptions granted?
Sure. Each school would handle the process differently. We don't have sight of how many exemptions were applied for and granted. My feeling would be that not a lot of parents understand that this is something that's available to them and don't necessarily make the necessary applications in the right form. And so it's an ongoing process that the schools apply to share with parents that they have the right, the necessary documentation that needs to be provided back to the school, the supporting documentation that goes with that, and how TPN then assists the school in identifying whether or not that application is successful in terms of the parents' affordability from an income perspective. The exemptions are granted based on a loss of income. It's not based on discretionary spend, the expenses that the parent may have. And of course, the school has a right to collect fees from both parents. So they would initially want to try and collect from both parents and then look at the exemptions, either from a single parent or from both parents, and then determine the level of exemption that would be granted to those parents.
Now, just talking to that, the fact that parents have lost their means of income, a lot of parents, and as you say, the school has the right to collect from both parents. But the question is then, what are the rights of the child? What are the rights of the parents in this instance? Can the school, because yesterday I was reading an article about a school in Soshanguve that was withholding reports because parents at this fee-paying school did not contribute. So what are the rights of the parents and the learner in particular in this instance to actually still access not just teaching and learning opportunities, but also get their results, even if they haven't paid their fees?
Absolutely. So withholding of school reports is not allowed. Even if a parent's account is not up to date, the child, the learner, may not be affected in terms of the quality of education that they receive, full access to education that they're entitled to, and of course the receiving of their reports at the end of that term or curriculum or year. So no, the withholding of reports is not allowed. So even in the instances of non-payment of school fees.
And we've been harping on this, trying to educate the public, but it would seem that schools still continue to do this, to withhold a learner's results. So I'm glad, you reiterated that point, that schools are not, to withhold learners' results under any circumstances. They have to give those to the learner and by extension to the parents. But how do you think this is actually contributing to the dropout levels at schools right now, the fact that parents are unable to pay for fees at these fee-paying schools?
Sure. Even in pre-lockdown, so we don't have the numbers for during the lockdown period for 2020, but if we look back in the pre-lockdown period of 2019, in the General Household Survey, SABC General Household Survey, it was cited that of those learners that did drop out of school, 22% of them cited that affordability was the problem. So the lack of finances to be able to go to school prevented them from continuing with their education. In terms of the same survey, parents cited that school fees were in their top 3 challenges that they faced in terms of dealing with the school. And one of those challenges, for example, would be the large classroom sizes. So, of course, if you don't have access to, at a fee-paying school, additional funds to pay your SGB teachers, what ends up happening is you end up with bigger classroom sizes. So parents, one of their frustrations and concerns were the size of classrooms in public schools and the cost of education. When you look at the schools on the flip side and you look at their challenges, in the top 3 challenges of school, the number 1 challenge is the collection of school fees. So finances becoming a difficult conversation between both parties, between both parents and the schools. And the schools also citing in their top 3 challenges a transportation of learners. So late arrivals of learners in both public and private school and the transportation of learners to school. Those were their top 3 challenges. Looking back at the General Household Survey, you see that 66% of our learners walk to school every day. So coming back to finance, transportation is an additional cost, and children on average are walking 30 minutes to school and 30 minutes back from school. 66% of our learners are walking to school. So these are the challenges that are faced. The school's then citing, well, if we had extra discretionary spend, how would we spend it? And classroom equipment, both in public and private school, coming up as their number 1 discretionary spend if they had it. And for public schools, it was IT infrastructure. So coming into the lockdown and doing a lot of online type learning, IT infrastructure would have been a big need from our public schools. In terms of the school's rights, though, in terms of collection, where a parent has successfully applied for an exemption, the school's not going to try and collect on it. What the schools are left with dealing with then are parents who legitimately are earning an income. And I do accept that many people have lost their income in full or in part, and they would be feeling budgetary constraints in terms of their general living expenses and their other commitments that they would have. But the school does have a right to collect where the parent is still earning an income and does not qualify for an exemption. And I think these are the challenges that many of the schools are dealing with at the moment.
Well, Michelle, thank you so much for sharing that with us. Very enlightening. Michelle Dickens from TPN Credit Bureau talking to us about how many parents whose children attend fee-paying schools are actually struggling to keep up with payments of school fees. And also, this has affected the dropout rate. A whopping 22% of children attending fee-paying schools dropping out because their parents are unable to pay those fees. So feel free to let us know your views at Morning Live SABC. At 7:30, let's bring you the latest news headlines with